Imagine a world where no one ever goes hungry, where disease has been eradicated, where crime does not exist, and where the concept of labor has been abolished entirely. You wake up every single day knowing that your survival is guaranteed, that your comfort is absolute, and that no force on earth can threaten your existence. It sounds like the premise of every utopian fantasy ever written, the endpoint of human progress, the very thing civilizations have spent millennia striving toward. Now imagine that in this paradise the inhabitants do not thrive, they do not celebrate, they do not build monuments or compose symphonies or fall in love under starlit skies. Instead, they stop reproducing, they stop communicating, they stop caring whether they live or die at all, and then quietly they vanish. This is not science fiction. This is not a thought experiment dreamed up by a philosopher in an armchair. This is what actually happened when a behavioral scientist named John B. Calhoun built a paradise for mice in 1968, and what he witnessed inside that enclosure would haunt him for the rest of his life. He called it Universe 25, and what died inside that cage was not just a colony of rodents. It was the illusion that abundance alone is enough to sustain a society. John Bumpus Calhoun was not a man given to dramatics. He was a researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health, a man who spent his career studying the effects of population density on animal behavior. And by the time he constructed Universe 25, he had already spent decades watching societies collapse under the weight of their own success. He had built Universe 1 through Universe 24, each one a variation on the same theme, each one a sealed world where rats or mice were given everything they could possibly need and then left alone to see what they would build. Some of those earlier universes had collapsed into violence. Others had settled into strange, rigid hierarchies that never changed. But Universe 25 was different. Universe 25 was perfect. Calhoun designed it to be a genuine paradise, a 16 by 8 foot enclosure divided into 4 identical pens, each one capable of comfortably housing dozens of mice with room to spare. The walls were smooth and unclimbable, preventing escape but also preventing the territorial disputes that come with defensible borders. The floors were covered in soft bedding. The temperature was kept at a constant 70 degrees. There were no predators, there were no parasites, there were no winters, and most importantly, there were 256 separate living apartments, each one connected by ramps and tunnels, each one equipped with unlimited food dispensers and unlimited water bottles, each one designed to eliminate scarcity entirely. A single pair of mice could theoretically produce thousands of descendants without ever running out of space, without ever experiencing hunger, without ever knowing fear. Calhoun estimated that the enclosure could support nearly 4,000 mice before physical overcrowding became a genuine issue. He started with 4 breeding pairs, 8 mice total, and then he closed the lid, turned on the lights, and waited to see what paradise looked like. For the first 104 days, nothing happened. The 8 original mice explored their new world cautiously, sniffing at the corners, testing the ramps, establishing small territories in the apartments they liked best. They bred slowly at first, as wild mice do when introduced to a new environment, producing litters of 6 or 7 pups that grew up healthy and strong. By day 104, the population had reached 62. That was the last moment of normalcy, because once the mice realized that this world had no limits, once the biological brakes that normally slow reproduction in response to environmental pressure were removed, the population did not grow. It detonated. By day 315, there were 620 mice. By day 560, there were 2,200. The enclosure that had been designed to hold 4,000 was filling up faster than anyone had predicted, not because the mice were running out of space, but because the social structure of the colony was beginning to fracture in ways that had nothing to do with physical crowding. The population peaked at 2,200 and then, inexplicably, stopped growing. The birth rate plummeted, infant mortality skyrocketed, and the mice began to behave in ways that no mouse had ever behaved before. The first signs of collapse were subtle, easy to miss if you were not looking for them. In a normal mouse society, males establish territories, defend them against intruders, and compete for access to females. Females build nests, raise their young communally, but with clear maternal bonds. and maintain a social fabric that keeps the colony functional even under stress. But in Universe 25, the concept of territory had become meaningless. There were no borders to defend, no resources to protect, no scarcity to fight over. A male mouse could wander into any apartment he wanted, sleep in any nest he found, eat from any food dispenser he encountered. And without the organizing principle of scarcity, the social architecture of the colony began to dissolve. Dominant males still tried to establish harems, still tried to control access to the most desirable nesting sites, but their territories were porous, indefensible, meaningless. They would fight off one intruder only to find 3 more had wandered in while their backs were turned. The stress of this constant feudal defense began to manifest in bizarre ways. Some males became hyper-aggressive, attacking any mouse that came near them, regardless of whether there was anything to gain. Others simply stopped fighting entirely. They stopped establishing territories. They stopped seeking mates. They stopped doing almost everything that made them mice, and instead, they retreated to the most isolated corners of the enclosure, the empty apartments that no one else wanted, the spaces farthest from the food dispensers and the nesting sites and the chaos of the colony center. Calhoun called these withdrawn males the beautiful ones, and the name was not ironic. These mice were striking to look at. Their fur was immaculate, groomed to a shine that no wild mouse could ever achieve, because grooming was almost the only activity they engaged in. They did not fight, they did not mate, they did not explore, they did not play. They woke up, they ate, they groomed themselves for hours at a time, and then they went back to sleep. They were physically perfect specimens of mousehood, untouched by the wounds and scars of social combat, unburdened by the stress of reproduction, living lives of absolute leisure in their isolated apartments. And they were completely, irretrievably broken. When Calhoun introduced female mice into their apartments, hoping to restart the breeding process, the beautiful ones showed no interest. They did not attack the females. They did not court them. They simply ignored them, continuing to groom themselves as if the females were furniture, as if the biological imperative that drives every living thing to reproduce had been surgically removed from their brains. They were not gay, Calhoun noted, because they did not engage in homosexual behavior either. They were not asexual in the biological sense, because their bodies were fully functional. They were simply done. They had opted out of the social contract entirely, and nothing Calhoun tried could bring them back. The females were collapsing too, though in different ways. In the early days of Universe 25, mother mice had been attentive, building elaborate nests, nursing their pups for the full 21 days, teaching them to forage and socialize. But as the population density increased, as the social structure dissolved into chaos, maternal behavior began to deteriorate. Some mothers stopped building nests entirely, giving birth on the bare wire floors of the apartments where their pups quickly died of exposure. Others built nests but abandoned them, wandering away to groom themselves or fight with other females, leaving their blind, helpless offspring to starve. Still others became actively violent, attacking their own pups, killing and sometimes cannibalizing them in ways that no wild mouse would ever do. The infant mortality rate climbed to nearly 100% in some apartments. Pups that did survive were often wounded, missing ears or tails, traumatized by the random violence of adults who no longer recognized the social taboo against harming the young. And the pups that survived to adulthood were themselves damaged, raised without normal maternal care, without the play behavior that teaches young mice how to navigate social hierarchies, without any model for how to be functional members of a colony. They entered adulthood already broken, already prone to the same withdrawal and violence they had witnessed as children, and the cycle accelerated with each generation. By day 600, the colony had entered what Calhoun called the death phase, though death was not the most striking feature of it. The population had begun to decline, slowly at first and then with increasing speed, but the physical space was still full of mice. They were just not the right kind of mice. The beautiful ones now made up a significant portion of the population, hundreds of perfectly groomed, perfectly healthy males living in isolated apartments, eating and sleeping and grooming and waiting for nothing. The remaining socially active mice were concentrated in the center of the enclosure, where the food dispensers were located, and their behavior had become almost unrecognizable. Hyper-aggressive males roamed the feeding areas in packs, attacking any mouse that approached, not for territory, not for mates, but seemingly for the sheer stimulation of violence itself. Females in the center had stopped reproducing entirely, their estrus cycles disrupted by stress, their maternal instincts suppressed by the chaos around them. The few pups that were born were immediately at risk, vulnerable to the random violence of adults who no longer distinguished between food competitors and offspring. And through it all, the food dispensers continued to operate. The water bottles remained full, the temperature stayed at 70 degrees, and the lights never dimmed. The mice were dying of abundance. The parallels to human society were not lost on Calhoun, and they should not be lost on us. He wrote extensively about what he called the behavioral sink, the point at which a population's social structure collapses under the weight of its own density, not because there is not enough space or food or water, but because the psychological architecture that makes social life possible has been destroyed. And he warned explicitly and repeatedly that human cities were becoming behavioral sinks. Look at the modern metropolis, he might have said if he were alive today. Look at the apartment towers where thousands of people live stacked on top of each other, physically closer to more human beings than any generation in history, yet reporting higher rates of loneliness and isolation than ever before. Look at the young men who retreat into their bedrooms, into their screens, into worlds of infinite entertainment that require no social risk, no territorial defense, no mating effort, grooming themselves with video games and social media instead of fur, perfectly healthy, perfectly safe, and perfectly disconnected from the reproductive economy of their species. Look at the declining birth rates in every developed nation, the collapse of marriage and family formation, the rise of what demographers call the sex recession, where young people are having less physical intimacy than their parents or grandparents did at the same age, not because of scarcity, but because of its opposite, because the social scripts that once organized mating behavior have dissolved in a world of unlimited options and zero consequences. Calhoun died in 1995, long before the smartphone, long before social media, long before the gig economy and remote work and dating apps that present an infinite scroll of potential mates while somehow producing less connection than ever. But he would have recognized the patterns instantly. The beautiful ones are among us. They are the men and women who have opted out, who have looked at the chaos of modern social life and decided that grooming, in whatever form their culture provides, is safer than engagement. They are not mentally ill, not in the clinical sense. They are not suffering from a chemical imbalance or a traumatic brain injury. They are responding rationally to a world that has eliminated scarcity without replacing it with meaning, that has given them unlimited comfort without giving them a reason to endure the discomfort of social connection. And like the beautiful ones in Universe 25, they are often physically healthy, often intellectually capable, often possessed of every advantage that their species can provide, and yet they are evolutionarily inert, contributing nothing to the future, participating in no community, raising no children, building no world. The death phase of Universe 25 ended on day 1780, when the last mouse died. The enclosure was still full of food and water. The temperature was still 70 degrees. The lights were still on. But the society was gone, and it had been gone for years before the last body stopped breathing. The final generations of mice had been raised without mothers, without play, without social learning of any kind, and they had never developed the behaviors necessary to sustain a colony. They were not killed by predators or famine or disease. They were killed by the absence of struggle, by the removal of every environmental pressure that might have forced them to adapt, to cooperate, to build something larger than themselves. Calhoun tried to save the colony in its final days, removing the beautiful ones to see if the remaining mice would restart society, introducing new breeding stock to inject fresh behavior into the gene pool. Nothing worked. The behavioral sink was irreversible. Once the social architecture collapsed, once the young were raised without models for how to be social animals, the damage was permanent. The mice had forgotten how to be mice, and no amount of food or space or medical care could teach them again. And so we are left with the question that Calhoun spent his life trying to answer, the question that should haunt every policymaker and urban planner and parent and young person staring at a screen in a darkened room. Are we living in Universe 25? Not literally, of course. We are not mice, and our societies are infinitely more complex than anything that can be replicated in a 16 by 8 foot enclosure. But the variables are the same: abundance without structure, comfort without purpose, density without connection, the removal of every external threat without the creation of any internal meaning. We have built cities that hold more people than Calhoun ever dreamed of, connected them with technologies that make physical distance irrelevant, eliminated hunger and disease and infant mortality in ways that would have seemed miraculous to every generation before ours. And in return, we have received epidemics of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and withdrawal that no one can fully explain. We have young people who have never known want, who have been given every advantage, who live in the safest and most prosperous societies in human history, and who report feeling empty, directionless, socially extinct in ways that mirror the beautiful ones with terrifying precision. The terrifying science of Universe 25 is not that abundance kills. It is that abundance without structure kills the will to live, the will to connect, the will to continue. It is that paradise left to its own devices does not produce angels. It produces ghosts. It produces perfectly healthy bodies with perfectly empty social calendars, perfectly safe apartments with perfectly silent phones, perfectly full refrigerators with perfectly empty dining tables. The mice in Universe 25 did not die because they were crowded. They died because they were alone in a crowd, because the social scripts that make isolation bearable had been shredded by the very abundance that was supposed to set them free. And if there is a lesson for us in that enclosure, it is not that we should return to scarcity and struggle and premature death. It is that abundance is not enough, that comfort is not enough, that the elimination of every external threat means nothing if we do not simultaneously build the internal structures, the social architectures, the shared meanings that make a life worth living. Universe 25 ended with a whimper, with the last mouse dying quietly in a corner, surrounded by food it would never eat, in a paradise it could not endure. The question is whether we are building the same paradise, and whether we will recognize the silence when it comes for us.